Finally, Timmy found a good blade of finest green grass, and he turned to attack the great awful dragon once more, and that silly Nurd did something very foolish. Here. Okay. Thanks. The Adventures of Timmy and Clara Nurd. And by the way, this is pencil marked up by the teacher too. He made sure I got all the commas. Once upon a time, not too long ago, there was a big family of nerds living happily together. There was Mom and Papa Nurd, Gran and Gramps, 11 nerd children. They had a happy home and never went anywhere. They just rolled around all day. Nerds do not have legs like people do. They are soft and cuddly, and their heads are terribly empty, so nerds are not very smart. Now, in this nerd family, there were two nerd children, Timmy and Clara Nurd, who were different from all other nerds. They wanted to have adventures and travel to strange, different lands, even though they were not very smart. Timmy and Clara found they could travel easily if they used a tricycle, skateboard, wagon, go-kart, raft, sawhorse, surfboard, or something else just as nerdy to help them travel. So Timmy and Clara Nurd set out for adventure one fine summer's day on their skateboards and took all their worldly belongings. They took Mama's good grimbleberry stew in a crock and the geese feather quilt that Gran made for them, and of course their umbrella, because nerds like standing in the rain, but if they get wet, their stuffing gets soggy and their empty heads fill up with water. Nothing happened the first night, and because they found no adventure, they put away their skateboards. They went to sleep in some soft grass under the moonlight. The next morning, bright and early, they got up and said, "Good morning," to the sun, as is customary with all good nerds. Timmy decided they should ride their sawhorses that day, so off they galloped in search of adventure. Of course, they did not gallop very fast because sawhorses have very stiff legs, but that was all right, because if they went any faster, Timmy and Clara would roll off. Well, in the middle of a clover forest, when a great big ugly worm popped up from his hole. Clara did not like worms, and she said, "That worm is grunge. Oh, he is ugly, isn't he, Timmy?" But Timmy thought the worm was the great awful dragon that Gramps told stories about. Timmy really had an empty head. So he told Clara to hurry out of the clover forest and said that he would stay and fight the dragon. Clara thought that Timmy was very silly. "Oh, Timmy, you are a nerd," and galloped off on her sawhorse, leaving Timmy to fight the great awful dragon alone. Timmy was very excited. This was his first adventure. He rolled and rolled on his sawhorse because he was so excited, then plop, he fell off his horse, and because he was such a silly nerd, he thought that the dragon, who was just an ugly worm, had attacked him. Quickly, he drew a blade of grass and used it for his sword. Well, he beat the dragon until the blade was bent and torn. He was very tired. He was so tired, but he wanted to kill the great awful dragon, so he dropped his torn blade and looked around for another. By this time, the ugly worm was getting tired too. He just popped out of his hole for a little fresh air. Now there was a silly nerd tickling him with a blade of grass. Until now, Timmy had not tickled his funny bone, so the worm had just chuckled softly to himself. But oh boy, that ugly worm was really ticklish under his 33rd left little leg. Finally, Timmy found a good blade of finest green grass, and he turned to attack the great awful dragon once more, and that silly nerd did something very foolish. He attacked the dragon right under his 33rd left little leg, and that ugly worm let out such a roar of laughter that the whole clover forest shook, and Timmy dropped his blade right away and hid behind the nearest clover tree. Well, the great awful dragon, who was just an ugly worm, like Clara said before, did not like to laugh because it hurt his awful, ugly face. And so he popped back into his hole and slithered home so fast that the earth shook. Even Clara, on the edge of the forest, felt the shaking. When the shaking finally went away, Timmy came out of his hiding place and saw that the great awful dragon had disappeared. Because his head was empty, Timmy thought that he had struck the dragon a mortal blow with his blade of finest green grass. So proudly, at least as proudly as a soft, cuddly nerd can be, Timmy got back on his sawhorse and rode off to tell Clara that the clover forest was now safe from the great awful dragon. Timmy and Clara had a feast that night to celebrate the slaying of the dragon. Clara's head was really just as empty as Timmy's, because she forgot that Timmy was being a silly nerd and that the dragon was just an ugly worm. But they had a good nerdy feast, and because they were even more stuffed than usual, they went to sleep early. And that night the stars twinkled merrily along with the moonlight, and on the moon's face was a big smile. The end. Thank you.